Hey, welcome to Process. My name is Dr. John Bush. We're continuing my Metric updated research for fantasy football, scienceoffantasyfootball.com. Check it out. This is consistency. We're getting deeper now into the player level. See part 1. This is part 2. Okay, the AI, when I punched in fantasy football consistency, this was one of the figures that AI did. So I guess it's kind of neat. I don't know. Anyway, let's go here. We have position player 2014 to 2023. The com data. The best, by the way, would be 100%. There'd be 16 weeks at above the positional median, which is around, 19 fantasy points for one quarterback, 4 fantasy point touchdown scoring. Right now you can rush and you get 6 points for rushing TD. So I have found through previous work, 40% or above is tier 1, 20% to 40, tier 2, below 20%, tier 3 quarterback. And we're looking across the years. There are a lot of situations where a quarterback is, in the top, and he continues and continues. And I'll actually show you the data, year-to-year data on some of that from this time span as well. You could at least kind of have a range of outcomes is what we're talking about here. But I sorted by 2023, and this is the kind of data that you get here. And sometimes you see some interesting things. I know people are interested in Stroud this year. He was 47. He's in the top tier, no doubt, but he wasn't at the top of the top tier as a rookie. So you hope maybe he'll get better. Josh Allen started at 42, next year 44, 56, 71, 75, 76. So probably the atypical evolution, right, of a quarterback. But Jalen Hurts, 13, 53, 73, 82. So you wonder, you would think Stroud at least stays at the top level, but does he move up into the 50s or the 60s? That would be, in other words, does he end up being the 4th, 5th best? I think best case scenario, probably, but that may be aggressive as well. Depends on value, right? At the end of the day, a lot of these people have metrics, but it's the value that you get in your draft at that moment. What's going on? So that part of the equation cannot be, predicted anyway, because you don't know. 12 people, you could be, say, 11 people in your draft. They could go crazy. Who knows what they're going to do? So you always have to think about that value as well. And I'm actually going to overlay this data with current ADP. That's coming. I think in our podcast, we're going to start off, Dennis and I will talk about running backs here. So that will be interesting. Anyway, this is some of the data, and this is 3rd tier data, and we do see there have been some really maybe fairly good quarterbacks that have kind of floundered a little bit. Gardner Minshew, there's a lot of talk about him, but he had 2020 was his best year. Then he's been in tier 2, and last year slipped down, top of tier 3. Trevor Lawrence, boy, he's had some hit and miss last year. So can they bounce back, right? Can they bounce back to a tier? I mean, if you look at somebody like Flacco, you see him, and then last year, like 60%. That's the best he's ever done. I think that's an exception. Don't think I see a lot of that. But you can look for situations and see what you think. This data at least gives you a historical perspective, and I think it kind of formulates your range of outcomes here. So let's take a look at the yearly data here. And the first is quarterbacks, 15 to 23. Percentage that were white, so that's tier 3, yellow tier 2, green tier 1. And notice that in the population of quarterbacks, we're talking 20%-ish. Some years we've had 25%. 2015, 29%. What a spectacular year for quarterbacks there in 2015. Last year, 20%. Seems like kind of average there. Next tier's about 23, and bottom tier's 57. So just randomly, most quarterbacks are in the lowest tier, but we, of course, make our living picking the right ones out in tier 1. Here's the data. Percentage of this year's green top tier that were green last year. CGLR last time. Okay, last. Okay, so has been somewhere between 15. 13. Boy, what a crappy year. It was one of the worst years for green as well, 12%. All the way to 71-70. So that is some variation, folks. You cannot walk away from variation. Last year was 40%. So I would think, since 19, one might think the range of outcomes is somewhere 40 to 70% chance that a good quarterback in tier 1 stays that way. Okay? If you were thinking it was 100%, that's not necessarily true, but it's somewhere between 40 to 70. I think that's reasonable. Yellow, a lot of variation. Third tier, pretty much the same. Rookie quarterbacks, at best, who have been in the top tier, 10% of that. So if you look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So 10% is 1.5. And last year we had Stroud and Browning. Okay? So on average, I think you could probably, there's been some crappy years. 0. But you figure, say, 10%. So you're thinking 1 rookie quarterback, maybe 2, maybe. So it doesn't mean 3 or 4 or 5. Okay, so for you to get aggressive and say, oh, I'm going to pick the 5th rookie quarterback because they're going to do good this year, you better have some data in your diary that shows that you could pick that way, because the stats say maybe one or two of those, rookie quarterbacks might make something of themselves. Yellow, somewhere between, there's been some interesting years, but notice these metrics tend to be a little bit at the high side better. So, and that makes sense, right? There's going to be more rookies in tier 2, than tier 1. Something to think about. Last year we had crappy tier 2 rookies. Not, maybe there was one. Was there one last year? Richardson, I guess he got hurt. That was it. So we had 1 last year and 2 in the top tier. So 3, and really Richardson, didn't do you much good. He was good when he was there, but 25%. But you hope his second year, you hope you get something like Hurts, right? Goes up into the 50s. People are predicting that. But here's the data here. You can check out this data. Okay. RBs. Again, total number, a lot more than quarterbacks because there's a lot more running backs to judge. So that's probably not surprising. You can look at that. Look at somebody like CMC. Oh my goodness, 88%. So basically 90% of the weeks, what is that, 15 weeks out of 16? This man was delivering the goodies. Wow. Kamara, 77 last year. Had a down year 2022, but look at the years before. Kamara's going in the 5th round, folks. Curlin Williams, and so forth. So you can look and see. So if you lay ADP on top of this, I think we're going to have some interesting RBs this year, at least current ADPs. And does that mean, we slavishly go with this data? No, it just means, okay, let's do some extra research. So if Kamara's in the 5th round, CMC's number 1, and there were only pretty much, I would say, not different. What is being perceived about Kamara this year? Why are they thinking that he's a 5th rounder versus CMC's a 1st rounder? Are they overplaying CMC relative to Kamara? Okay. You need to answer that question before you draft. Just like looking at all this data, make note of what is intriguing. And I think ADP gets you to the questioning quicker, right? That's why I like to do that. And we'll be talking about that. Maybe I'll have a lesson plan on that as well. Okay. But here's the top tier. Here's two RBs. Okay. I know Josh Jacobs are thinking switch teams. I mean, he dropped a little bit last year. Doesn't mean he can't come back. But we could look at that data. How many that were yellow last year turned up green this year? That would be an interesting stat. Eckler fell. He moved. There's going to be a lot of questions here, folks. A lot of questions. So, what are the RBs? Notice the percentages in Tier 3 are in the 70s. So the top tier RBs are less, like about 15, 16% of the population of RBs. Okay. Percentage who were green last year, 19 to 23 last year was the worst, 35%. So, but some of the best was in the 50s. So I think you could say somewhere between 60% and say, let's just wrap 40%. So 60% of 16 games was at 9, almost 10. And 40% is, what's that, 6.5, 7, between 7 and 10 is kind of who were green last year, is kind of a overall average, kind of a range, an average range. Okay. Don't have enough data to say who was number 1 last year and how many number 1. Well, I mean, how many years of data would you, I mean, you just don't have enough samples to look at that. We could get like top 5 or something. I might do that, but I think this is good enough here. The percentage green who were yellow last year, actually last year was 35%. But if you look historically, around 20 to 30%. So that means that 20 to 30% of these guys may make it. So what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 20% of 17, was that 4 to 30, so 4 to 6. So one would probably suspect the ones up in the high end would have a better shot, but I'm just saying overall, the data says around 20%, so maybe 4 of these. So if you reach into this pool, most of the time you're going to get a tier 2. Every once in a while you'll get a tier 1. So again, in the deeper rounds, you're probably going to get to choose some of these. Which ones do you think are going to make that? Given it's about 4 out of 17 or whatever I said. Okay. Statistically, you've got to juggle these range of outcomes. Okay. You cannot be definite in May. Okay. You just can't. We're just investigating and figuring out using reference class forecasting. We're just wanting to kind of get a feel for the range. Okay. If you're doing anything more in May, I know if you're on Twitter, people, oh yeah, here's the sleeper or whatever. They have to be definite to get those clicks. Okay. If they were realistic, they would realize it's squishier, right? That ground, is that quicksand or not? They have to pretend like quicksand's not quicksand. I'm telling you, in a minefield, you don't know 100% what you're going to step on next. Okay? So you've got to behave cautiously. Do lots of research. But in this tier, 4 of these guys. In this tier, let's say last 5 years, 50%, let's just say. So half of these guys will make it to the next level. Somewhere between 20% of them will make it to yellow tier, tier 2. And the other 20, so maybe 25, so half, 50, 25, maybe 25, tier 3. So there's going to be some failures. So who's the failures? Who's the tier 2 types? Who's the tier 1 types? That is the research you need to do between now and your serious drafting. But 50%, that's not bad. You're pulling out in this bowl, reaching in. Half the time, you're getting a goodie. Okay? The other half, But of the other half of the half is tier 2, which maybe you can recover from that. The thing is value. If something happens to CMC injury, first game, it's going to be a lot of people that, he's out for the season. You lost a lot of your draft capital at that point. You can't predict injuries. I'm just saying. But you've got to think about how do you construct your team to get away with that. That's why people do handcuffs and things like that, to try to mitigate risk, right? Puts and calls in your option trading. Rookies around 15, 20, sometimes a little higher, 20%. So let's say 15%. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 20. So let's say 20, 15%, 10% is 2, so 3. So somewhere around 3 or 4. Last year, it was 4. They were on the lower end. Gibbs, Walker, Deshane, and Bijan. Okay? But that's better than quarterbacks, where I said maybe 1 or 2. So, if you're hunting for rookie running backs, I think you could maybe pick 2 or 3. That seems reasonable to me. The thing is, when you go in and look at your rookies and you start seeing 5, 6, 7 you think have a tier 1 potential, something's not right. So this is a good check on you. If you're too optimistic about rookies, or if you look and say, oh, these rookies, I don't like any of them, probably 2 of them are going to surprise you. So again, range of outcomes allows you to juggle that data a little bit, those mental gymnastics that's going on. Okay. Tight ends. Not as many significant tight ends, so it's not surprised, not as many tier 1. Kincaid, a rookie. Laporta. So we have 2 rookies. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. That's, given the numbers here, just be aware of that. I don't, I'll look at the data here, and then here's the tier 2. Didn't even show the non-tier because you don't want any of those. Okay. At all. So this data says for the most part about 15%. We had some bad years, 17 to 19. That was a sad time. Green, who were green, around 40, 50%, so around 40%, let's just say. Maybe I'm too conservative in the last. Looks like around 40%, maybe 45. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 6 or 7 of these guys will continue tier 2. Very intriguing. So again, that means the other half, or a little bit more than that, will not continue. So can you spot and I'm going to call it with tight ends, the duds. Okay, again, figuring that out. Rookies, last year, 25% is pretty bad. But look at the year before, 6. Year before, 42. A lot of variation. I'm going to say 20% if I look kind of a thumbnail across the years. So 2 of those, or 20%. So we're talking 2. So I think Bowers, not sure draft-wise, do people think other than Bowers maybe? Is there another one? Maybe. Take a look at that other 1 or 2. Maybe people miss something. Maybe there's opportunities we're not seeing. Just be aware of that. Okay. So there's some more good data. You can check that out. Here's WRs. A lot more WRs out there. You could see a lot more last year. Some rookies. Puka, of course, 59%. That is so amazing to be almost 60% consistent. Wow. Tank Dell, 55%. Jalen Reed, 50%. 3 solid rookies last year, folks. 3 solid. Pretty good. Here's tier 2 and starting last year. Okay. So we had some that fell down. They're going to pop back up this year. Data, about 17% last year, but really closer to about 15, maybe 14. Green, who were green, I think 55% is probably realistic, folks. So that means a little bit more than half of these guys will continue to tier 1. So that's pretty good. Pretty good. Rookies, about 25%. So I think having 3 or 4 this year probably is not out of the question. Okay. ADP is going to tell you Harrison is going to be 1, etc., etc. Remember, Puka came out of nowhere last year, so be aware. Sometimes there's some these rookies that slip through the cracks and could surprise you. Given the number of wide receivers, given the historicalness of this data, which is some of the best for wide receivers, I would say put you some extra time in on these rookies wide receiver. People spend a lot of time. I think I'd spend a lot more time on rookie wide receivers than I would RBs and tight ends and quarterbacks, folks. That's where I'd be spending a lot of my time, my deep research. Big time. Okay. So overall, this is looking at each position. Green, who were green last year, gives you some of the metrics. Okay. I did some thumbnailing. Okay. Across the consistency. If you look at the distributions, why I love Box and Whisker, look at quarterbacks. Just when you're feeling good, you think, oh, quarterbacks are really steady. This data says they're not steady. And actually, this data says that the elite tight ends are what are going to put money in your pocket here. They're very, very likely to continue. The super elites, the 25 percentile guys. Here's RBs. Notice the upper end. That's a nice little selection. So there's some really good RBs. That's what it's telling me. Notice the wide receivers are very compact. So it's a little bit more of a scrum there. Just, in other words, I think I'm more confident about the elite RBs. I know people worry about injuries. And certainly elite tight ends than I are about the wide receivers. In other words, it seems like all these wide receivers are about the same in some ways, if you look at this distribution. I then asked the question, looking at positions, players who have had 2 Tier 1 COM seasons, what's their third season look like? This is the actual numbers. Wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends, RBs, so you can actually see the data here in the distribution. And if you look at the difference, wide receivers, really spectacular. RBs, really spectacular. Look at quarterbacks. Look at the distance, not much. Tight ends, not much. So if you do percentages, tight ends who are green to green, 2-season green, third year, 57% come through. WRs, 70%. QBs, 62%. RBs, 67%. Tight ends are the only one, about 10% less super consistency, if we want to call it that. So I think this at least gives you, if you've had 2 seasons, you're hitting closer to 70% shot that you're going to be consistent in your third year. What does that mean? That means 3 out of 10 won't be. So don't, come blow up my house there. I can't help it. It's up to you to deal with the uncertainty. But we start getting less uncertain if you say we've had 2 years. So if you look at the data, look at some of these guys that have had 2 years, and we know about 70% of these guys will deliver again. So just count them and look at them. I'll get to that later. Okay, that means 3 of these, 30% of these will be failures. Who's the failures? Who's the winners? It's up to you to do your research to figure it out. Okay, so I think when you've done 2 seasons at Tier 2, that is suggestive, right? You would not get these kind of numbers if there wasn't something to it. If it was all random, it would be hard to imagine that after 2 tiers, that if it has nothing to do with anything, you would still get 70% of those guys coming back Tier 1. I think it's just showing I haven't done the data, I haven't done the ANOVA and whatnot, but I'm pretty much confident that there is something to consistency modeling that I've done here, and I think it's worthy of study. I think it's worthy of you using this as guides in your drafts this year. So this is part 2. I went 30 minutes. I apologize. I'm a professor. I'm used to running my mouth. Okay. We'll have more stuff later. I think our next podcast, Dennis and I are going to hit the comms and the RBs, and I think he may get his MVP consistency metric. That would be really neat to see how that jives with what I'm doing here. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed part 2. Check out part 1 if you hadn't seen it. And I've got some background on comm as well last year, and you can kind of see what was what for last year. Okay, this is Dr. Bush for the Science of Fantasy Football. For my process, good luck. Let's crush this year, 2024.